Thank you all for joining topic lecture number 3. This is a topic lecture intended to address a few of the different critical areas connected to this year's topic. I would go ahead and label this a critically leaning topic. We're debating this at a crucial time in a national debate about systemic racism, the afterlife of slavery, and the Black Lives Matter movement. The wave of protest activity following the death of George Floyd and many other people of color at the hands of the police has highlighted deep disagreement over how to understand America's criminal justice system and what way forward, if any, we can find in an era of mass incarceration and rising white nationalism. There are many different positions and perspectives to cover when it comes to critically related areas to this topic. We're providing a variety of lectures to help you navigate those components. I'm going to focus on abolitionism and a variation of the criticism of neoliberalism that we're referring to as the right on crime K. Shri has a lecture posted introducing Afro-pessimism. Sean Kennedy, a longtime coach at Kansas, will be posting lectures covering 2 of the critical historical perspectives that are most prominent in locating US criminal justice among wider debates. He's divided those lectures into From Slavery to Mass Incarceration and the Political Economy of Policing. And your lab leaders will make those links available in the next day or 2. Like I said, I'll leave some time for Q&A today, but for some areas, I'm going to direct you to those lectures because they'll be fairly comprehensive, in particular, some of the historical material that I usually enjoy covering, but I think Sean is going to do a pretty deep dive on both of those. As we move into elective options during weeks 2 and 3, there will also be electives offered by all of the teaching staff to add to these topics, and Sean will also be offering electives that develop on his lectures as well as visiting some of your labs. For those who watched my all too brief introduction to how I think about critical debate and critique strategy, you'll know that I tend to think of this as a set of strategies that provide reasons for thinking systematically about the 1AC rather than focus on the plan. I encourage you to watch that lecture later if you haven't already to provide some background for my approach to these strategies that inform some of my thinking about each one of these positions. And even though it's ironic, I'm starting this presentation with a discussion of abolitionist critical perspectives, I think we want to approach abolition as more than a debate about the scope of the affirmative plan. There will be a robust debate in this area about reformist versus abolitionist approaches to criminal justice, and we'll cover that as part of this talk. But I want you all to understand that I think that there's a much deeper divide than simply the scope of the response to the problem. There's a very deep set of differences between abolitionists and some reformers or advocates for aspects of criminal justice reform in terms of problem definition. That is, how these different perspectives understand what's at stake and what problems there are that need to be addressed. For instance, Rachel Herzing describes the difference between reformers and abolitionists in the following way, quote, "Reformers see the system as broken, something that can be fixed with tweaks or some changes, whereas abolitionists tend to think that the system works really well. It is efficient in containing, controlling, killing, and disappearing the people that it is meant to." That divide over problem definition means that we need to think a little bit more broadly than just about the scope of a particular affirmative plan. That rhetoric of tweaks or small changes, I think, does lend itself towards link arguments made versus some plans, but there's a much broader sense in which some of the commitments made by different 1ACs may be contrary to abolitionist goals and perspectives. And if you think about that quote above, part of what we're talking about here is, do we define problems in criminal justice? And I'm using the terminology of criminal justice, though the terminology suggested by abolitionists would be pretty different. We'll get into that. Do the problems in criminal justice, are they deviation from legitimate ends, or do they reflect the deep commitments and historical underpinnings of the institutions of police and prisons? Even the label of mass incarceration that I used to introduce this lecture is criticized by some abolitionists because it fits into a storyline that treats the present era as exceptional rather than as one that is continuous with the history of American political development. which kind of brings me to what I think of as an overarching and crucial element of the abolitionist perspective, and that's abolitionism as a frame for understanding the police and prisons, draws deeply on the historical ties of policing in the United States to slavery and to white supremacy, as well as white supremacy as a global phenomenon that's characterized by Euro-American imperialism and conquest. And you know, as I mentioned, Sean's going to be presenting a lecture on From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. And so I encourage you to think about this as a portion of this elective where I'll handle a couple historical examples or a couple historical details, but the kind of broader arc and the level of detail that's important for understanding some of this perspective is going to come out in that lecture as well. You know, that's important supplementary material. One issue to highlight here is the origin, understood by abolitionists, of American policing in slave patrols and the organization of white communities around the suppression of enslaved resistance and the organization of the United States around the philosophy of white supremacy and the domination of Black enslaved peoples. And the terminology of abolitionism in the context of prison abolition, you know, one of the most prominent figures to identify here is Professor Angela Davis, a member of the Black Panther Party. She used the terminology of prison abolition to connect her perspective on prisons to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is one of the most prominent public Black intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. Eventually a professor at Harvard, a famous sociologist. Du Bois's perspective on abolition and his use of the terminology of abolition reflected his own struggle to understand and characterize the aftermath of the American Civil War and the institution of Jim Crow following the end of Reconstruction. Du Bois wrote a very large sociological text called Black Reconstruction, and it's an examination of the Reconstruction era. So, you know, we're talking here about post-American Civil War. 1865 marks the end of the military aspects of the American Civil War, and the beginning of Reconstruction. That is the process for reconstructing and readmitting the Confederate States into the United States. And the process of Reconstruction and the Reconstruction era, from the perspective of Du Bois, reflects the kind of moment in American political development where formerly enslaved Black people exercised a degree of political control and self-determination not found in other eras in the United States. And that Reconstruction for him represented a kind of moment of potential for radical change in American political development that was unrealized and quashed actively by the forces of a resurgent white supremacy. And Du Bois's account in Black Reconstruction was intended to refute the dominant, largely white interpretation of Reconstruction as failure and overreach. So this is, you know, late in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, you have a number of very prominent American historians, white historians, writing a history of Reconstruction that stressed the kind of misbehaviors, corruption, the failures of the Reconstruction agencies, including the Freedmen's Bureau, established to, like I said, reintegrate the Confederate States into the Union, but also to see through the abolition of slavery in the way intended by, there's a conflict between Congress and the president here. The radical Republicans in Congress represented a faction that wanted the Reconstruction process to involve wholesale redistribution of land, a complete reorganization of the political economy of the United States. And President Andrew Johnson, you know, who had been Lincoln's vice president, was a Democrat himself rather than a Republican. You know, the party affiliations switched, so many of the positions that you might associate with Republicans and Democrats are switched during this era. Johnson and others who were less radical in the Congress fought to ensure that Reconstruction would have as limited an impact as possible on the Southern states and their organization. And Du Bois's terminology of abolition and abolition democracy reflected what he saw as the collective agency of formerly enslaved Black people to organize politically, to control legislatures and localities in the Southern states, and to exercise a form of self-determination not seen in other eras in the United States. Angela Davis drew on this terminology of abolition and for prison abolition as a way to highlight continuity with a Black radical tradition and moments of Black political organization that could reflect the abolition of white supremacy as a system, not simply the legal abolition of slavery. So like Du Bois and many in the Black radical tradition, Davis is concerned with the ways in which our present institutions maintain and in many ways reflect the values of white supremacy that were part and parcel of United States political economy organized around slavery. Abolition then names carceral techniques and institutions as the problem. So, reflecting that idea of problem definition that I mentioned above, carceral techniques and institutions as the problem rather than particular manifestations or egregious examples of those institutions as, deserving reform or refiguration. If you think back to Miles's topic lecture and the different paradigms that are commonly understood to influence the way that criminal justice institutions in this country work, he named 4 of those paradigms, 3 of which I would say are, tend to be found in more mainstream discussion of the purpose of criminal justice in the United States. Those were rehabilitation, retribution, and deterrence. The 4th that he mentioned, restorative justice, is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. But I would say that for abolitionists, each of the first 3 paradigms, that is rehabilitation, retribution, and deterrence, are characterized, they're all part of a logic of carcerality, okay? This is a term that reflects the centrality of incarceration, okay? So we'll talk about what it means to name a logic of carcerality. And I know that term may seem complex or confusing. It's a way of describing essentially the motivating force or understanding and worldview that is that animates these institutions. Okay, so in thinking about what abolitionists mean by a carceral logic, I want to use a couple examples from abolitionist writing. So Dorothy Roberts writes, "All institutions in the US increasingly address social inequality by punishing the communities that are most marginalized by it. Systems that ostensibly exist to serve people's needs, healthcare, education, and public housing, as well as public assistance and child welfare, have become behavior modification programs that regulate the people who rely on them, and these systems resort to a variety of punitive measures to enforce compliance." That is, we see even in institutions that aren't explicitly designed as institutions that are for the policing of crimes or the naming of criminals and the enforcement of criminal law, that we see some of the pieces of criminal law seeping into or potentially deeply embedded, depending on your perspective, some of the other institutions that are ostensibly designed as mechanisms for social provisioning, that is, for providing assistance to various people in the United States. Another abolitionist scholar, Dylan Rodriguez, writes, "Incarceration takes the form of narrative, juridical, spatial, and socio-political processes through which the criminalized or otherwise ontologically and socio-culturally pathologized populations are rendered collective targets of state-sanctioned social liquidation and political neutralization. These processes may or may not involve premature physiological death and militarized killing. The immediate and accumulated individual and collective experiences of incarceration, however, are consistently articulated by captive populations in the vernaculars of warfare, survival, and involuntary intimacy with constant bodily and spiritual vulnerabilities to violence and degradation. As such, incarceration is simultaneously repressive, and productive power, a method of normalized, legally ordained, dominance and violence over particular people's physiologies and environments. It is a technology of social order and a cohering of peace, lawfulness, and security through war, violence, and punishment. Incarceration, understood as a systematic logic and institutional methodology, materializes through numerous regimes of dominance, from apartheid, military occupation, imprisonment, and compulsory schooling to Native American reservations, environmental racism, and normative sexual categorizations. So I want to unpack this set of cards a little bit to try and talk you through some of the terminology. First, in reference to a logic, okay, if you think about what's meant here by a logic is a set of rules for fitting different elements together into a coherent system. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea of formal logic or mathematical logic, right, in which you learn the rules that govern a system for fitting different operations and elements together, true and false, different mathematical operations. Referring to carceral systems or carcerality as a logic, okay, highlights that this is a criticism of a set of rules that governs how different parts of the American social system fit together. Carceral systems as a different, and I'm using the kind of notion of elements or pieces here, not in a way to, I'm reflecting the terminology here rather than supporting it. That is, this is not to say that people should be treated as pieces or elements of a system, but I think that that's the way that this set of authors understands what the process of carcerality entails and the logic of carcerality entails. And, in terms of how these different elements are put together, abolitionists treat the contemporary logic of criminalization as an outgrowth of conquest and captivity. So that is both the kind of rise of the American state as an outgrowth of colonization and conquest, the seizure of indigenous lands and the claim of the right to rule over this land as a nation state, and captivity, as in the centrality of slavery for the organization of the political economy of that same nation state. And the names used in these systems have changed and evolved, but their underlying set of relationships is designed to remain. Okay, that's why there's conversation here about an underlying logic. That is that some of the names or the exact relationships between some of the elements in these systems might be different, but the coherent system that puts them all together remains roughly the same, or should be treated as the same, that is, as historically continuous, right? Rather than naming us as living in an exceptional moment of mass incarceration. And the primary relationship found in the logic of carceral institutions is one of domination, as found in white supremacy of white over non-white and owner over non-owner. That is, there's a standard for full personhood, and these systems are designed to ensure that only a limited section of the population will ever be treated as a true or a full person. From this perspective, personhood for some is conditioned on the captivity of others. And that's where, to just talk through a couple terms in that Rodriguez card, I want you to notice, so first, naming, sometimes I understand that reading some of these longer paragraphs, it might seem like some of the words that are being used are either synonymous or, feel like they're, they might be repetitive, but sometimes it's useful to think through those seemingly, potentially repetitive elements to get at what the interlocking aspects of these systems are, as highlighted by this set of authors. So, for instance, when Rodriguez starts off with that phrase that incarceration takes the form of narrative, juridical, spatial, and socio-political processes, okay, you might think about the way that all of those are at play in our understanding of criminality. So narrative, that is, we receive and process our understanding of crime through a form of storytelling. You might think of this in terms of mass media representations. There's definitely been, as a potentially easy example, there are a number of conversations going on right now about the kind of mass media or public representation of police forces in TV shows in much of the media that we consume, right? That the kind of law and order style procedural show represents a very particular perspective, a dominant one generally, on how this set of institutions is designed to work and what they achieve, right? This notion that generally most criminal investigations are founded in, going after individuals who have committed horrible crimes, and the kind of sophisticated policing techniques and evidence that are available, the circumvention of various bureaucratic boundaries that are designed to protect criminals at the expense of good policing, right? That might be one example of a form of narrative in which people learn to treat and understand criminality in a particular way. Juridical, that is, to deal with the legal system. So clearly, this might be the linkage that you're most familiar with, that they're the way of understanding the operations of the executive components of policing in the United States and running prisons. Some of the policies that were mentioned in the other topic lectures and the relationship between other agents that are mentioned in the topic lectures, that those juridical components of the criminal justice system are designed to operate in a particular way. Spatial, right? That the organization of space in the United States is not neutral, both in the sense that the systems for categorizing space might themselves be grounded in conquest and captivity. So, for instance, that the regime of property found in the United States is one that directly rests on conquest in many ways. And, as mentioned in this set of evidence, the discussion of Native American reservations, right, that the eventual breaking up of collective land ownership in favor of private plots of land, and the breaking of tribal systems of land control and the Dawes Act might be an example that some of you are familiar with from history classes about the way in which the organization of space in the United States and the organization of property is grounded in conquest. And then socio-political processes. That is, we're not talking only about the operation of the legal system or of the courts and criminal justice, that the electoral system, the ways in which political power is organized and social power is organized in terms of, kind of who has legitimacy or credibility in public presentation, the narrative structure that influences who gets that credibility. All of these processes are at play in understanding a logic of carcerality. And that gets at part of what I was trying to highlight strategically about the way in which I think a number of these debates are about more than the plan. The value systems that undergird, or the logics that inform a number of different affirmative choices that aren't just about the plan, those are significant things for thinking about debating what it means to be aligned with an abolitionist politics. Okay. A couple other phrases that I wanted to touch on from that piece of evidence. The notion that incarceration is simultaneously repressive and productive power. That is that, the repressive components that are designed to ensure relations of dominance are also productive of the other side of that relationship. That is, what it is to be a full person, who it is to be a full person, involves the productive elements of defining oneself, the process of what some authors in this area might refer to as subject formation, a term that I can help people break down in the Q&A if you have questions about that. That is, what it means to exercise and to be a full person. There's a productive element to that too. So, for instance, speaking as a white male in this society or in this country, there are elements of my own personal credibility, the positioning that I speak with on these issues, they are productive elements. They are produced by some of these other systems, even if I am not directly implicated in immediate repression, in the sense that I'm not working as a police officer. I work as an educator, but that doesn't mean that many aspects of my position aren't produced by or in some way influenced by these underlying logics of carcerality from this perspective. I want to pause here to kind of allow for some question and answer period. How does the Abolition K utilize the phrase subject formation? What does that mean in the context of criminal justice? So subject formation refers to the way in which what we might otherwise think about as personhood, okay, so to be a subject, if you think about in kind of the Western philosophical tradition, there is a classic divide between subject and object, okay? The subject is refers to an actor, an agent, right? A person. There's capacity there for will and choice. An object is acted upon. It is static. It doesn't have its own will. And if you think about the language that we use for subjectivity or objectivity, right? If something is subjective, it relates to how I feel or how I understand. We refer to objectivity, and all of these terms are challenged by a variety of different schools, but just we refer to objectivity in the sense of removing the knower, right? Or removing the agent from how we know. So, if you think about, if you're in physics or your chemistry class, right? That's a form of natural science that's designed around the concept of objectivity. That is, it doesn't matter who I am, if we conduct these experiments, they can be replicable. They're replicable across different contexts. They're not context specific. They're not subject specific. They could be established as objective law-like behavior, okay? And the abolitionist perspective, and certainly some of the Rodriguez evidence that I was reading, is influenced by a number of other positions that criticize this kind of basic divide between subject and object. That is, there's no any choice about how we define and understand what it means to be an agent, to be able to act, to have capacity to act, that all of those are then choices about how we understand what it means to be an actor. So for example, in debates about colonization, in the kind of origins of the Spanish Empire and the Spanish conquest, there's a set of debates in Spain, in Valladolid, the then capital of Spain. If you look up the Valladolid debates between, like the two major figures are Sepulveda and Bartolomé de las Casas. One of the debates that they're having is basically about the category of whether or not there exist in the world natural slaves, okay? And, for instance, whether or not indigenous peoples found in the Americas have souls. Can they be saved? Can they be converted? There's a number of criticisms that suggest that both sides of this debate ought to be read through the lens of colonialism rather than as often interpreted that Las Casas represents this humanitarian perspective, kind of sensitive to the mistreatment of indigenous peoples at the hands of Spanish conquistadors. But what I'm trying to get at here is, right, in any philosophical system or worldview, there are some basic assumptions that are being made about what it means to be an actor, what it means to be a person. Personhood itself is an example. I'm using that as a synonym, even though, maybe we shouldn't, or it's not an assumed category. And the way that this plays out in the context of criminal justice, in the context of some of these abolitionist perspectives is, when I mentioned that notion of narrative process, right? How we narrate kind of who has the opportunity to speak, how we understand the different capacities or characteristics of different actors. So there's also that part of that Rodriguez cards that mentioned the idea of ontological criminalization, that is essentially treating some populations as being intrinsically or inherently criminal. That would be an example of the ways in which, when I mentioned that kind of the productive element of this is that some of the, dominant aspects of participation in the system, the subject positions that are available to some of us and not others, right? Those are examples of the way in which the very core elements of who I am, how I can speak, who I can speak to, those are influenced by a number of other processes that aren't controlled by me directly. That is, my subject position is a product of other social forces. So, being interpreted as, or, hailed as white male, like, that's not because I've spent my life defining what whiteness is or what maleness is, but instead living out a subject position that is informed by a structure of whiteness and a structure of gender. So I hope that helps answer that question. Part of that language shows up in a variety of critical positions because it draws attention to the way in which locating ourselves in debate and in the process of debating means accounting for those subject positions that are available or, constructed by various different logics, like we were talking about earlier. Discourses would be another. It's not worth getting into here, the kind of technical difference that you might use for a logic versus a discourse, but just there are different terminologies that people are going to use to refer to what is strategically a fairly similar argument, I think, in debate. Okay. Didn't understand the productive aspect of incarceration. I guess that it's important to understand, like one example that I might give here is the idea that incarceration doesn't work purely as a repressive institution. It produces some other things as well. So simply to like being defined as not criminal is a positive project. And so there are some aspects of, like personal presentation, narrative perception that involve the productive elements of how one is understood as not criminal. The like various, like if you think about the ways in which I might carry around with like, here I am and I'm speaking to you from a home. It's one that I rent, but right, I have living space that's available for me with a great deal of privacy. Privacy itself is an example of a kind of contested concept that has a history as well. And there are productive elements to this power that are going on, even as, I wouldn't be out there acting as like prison guard or police officer. There are many elements of where I'm located in our society that are produced by or influenced by the presence of these carceral systems. Like, the way in which the ownership of property is organized, the voting systems are organized, whether or not my vote will be counted, all of that kind of set of elements. Those are, kind of the productive elements of this power, that they don't just operate repressively. I hope that helps. Examples of how people are dispossessed in the criminal justice system related to the loss of personhood suggestion. So the phrase that you might see in some of these contexts, we're, I think, accustomed in debate to talking about via Afro-pessimism theories of social death, influenced by the work of Orlando Patterson and his definition of slavery. A lot of the people in this area refer to the notion of civil death. That is that there are, so the inability of felons to vote in most or many states is an example of civil death. The fact that, background checks on criminal convictions are oftentimes conditions of employment. There are a number of people in this area who talk about the ways in which kind of and this is once again logic of carcerality, right? That a number of these features of a carceral system of the prison are found in or are seeping out into a number of other institutions. So, that people who are on parole face increasingly high levels of surveillance, random drug testing, and kind of the punitive aspects of parole have changed a great deal in the past several decades. And so there are many ways in which dispossession might be about some of the effects that come with ever being named or convicted as a criminal, rather than only the time spent in prison or jail. Modern example of a spatial aspect of carcerality. Example of this, I bet many of you are familiar with the debate over gerrymandering, right? The kind of construction of representative districts and the use of statistics in the census to, allocate resources is another example of kind of a way in which state techniques for gathering information are related to the distribution of resources by that state. Well, in the spatial organization of the prison system, there are now a very large number of counties or municipalities in the United States that they're largely rural. Their free population is almost exclusively white, but they play host to a very large number of persons of color who are imprisoned in large prison facilities in that county. The census data counts prisoners as residing in that county, rather than in residing, kind of where their home was, where they were convicted. That's a spatial organization that affects the distribution of resources in a way that, is like, it's another one of these things, like, is that a perverse outcome of the system, or is that a way in which the system is designed? I think from the abolitionist perspective, you'd say that that's built into the design. Another aspect of this, my guess is that for many of you, you have not, like, the prison, there's a discussion of the way in which the prison walls are built just as much to keep others out as to keep prisoners in. That there's, to some degree, some portion of invisibility that, despite the fact that the US incarcerates people at a rate that is, you know, comparable to, or I think in some cases, historical comparisons have said higher than the Soviet Gulag system for, you know, political imprisonment, that that does not necessarily mean that the prison system is physically present for many people living in middle or upper class America. Like, there's a reason that these prisons aren't housed in relatively wealthy communities. They're generally, you know, treated as kind of jobs programs in poor rural communities. That's part of the way that this system gets built, so as to obscure its operations from people who otherwise might be curious about it or face some of the consequences of it. Emily asks about explaining more about the concept of personhood being determined on the captivity of others. I guess that, you know, the phrase that I hope that earlier discussion helped with this, but, you know, the example used here in that Rodriguez evidence of kind of ontological criminality, that idea that to be Black is to be associated with criminality, you know, the being determined on the captivity of others, that is, my whiteness is defined by its relationship to captivity in its own way. That is, that, you know, to not be regarded as intrinsically suspect or as intrinsically criminal from this perspective is an important element of what comes with the privileges of being white. There's a question from Richard, a good one, about kind of indigenous groups and their relationship to abolitionism. I honestly think that that would be a good question for research there. I don't, like, yes, there are sources that connect these issues. I don't have immediately available for this lecture a set of cards that you would use. And so, you know, I would encourage you to reach out and explore some of that. In relationship to criminal justice reform, carceral logic or punitive. Okay. Punitive means like, it's to deal, it's the same as, it's characteristic of punishment. Okay, so a punitive response is one that is characterized by punishment. You see how it's like they have the same root? So a punitive response is one that is aimed at punishing people. And, you know, punishment as the response to crime is not, from an abolitionist perspective, punishment is not an automatic response to crime. It's one that reflects the social and political choices of, you know, a set of agents who believe that and use punishment essentially as a form of social control. So strategically, what do some of the concepts that I've been talking about mean for debate? I think that I've mentioned this before, but I want to stress, I think that this means that link arguments about abolition should include criticisms of the value systems that underlie affirmative advantage arguments. Okay, if you think about the way in which some of the affirmative advantages on this topic are designed to, or likely designed to, preempt some of the primary negative strategies, or are just designed around the kind of large magnitude impact that oftentimes might be separate from an impact about the prison system, right? If you think about reading the economy as an impact, arguments about resource overstretch and efficiency, so like making different policing agencies work better because, you know, a number of the measures that have been adopted in this era, plenty of people believe that they're ineffective even at achieving their own goals. So some of the advantage arguments and internal link arguments that are written from that perspective, you know, are literally about making policing work better. Different models for federalism, separation of powers, jurisdiction, modeling arguments about the effect of kind of US courts or separation of powers doctrine for other states. All of those are examples of, you know, value systems that I think would be heavily criticized by most abolitionists. And so, you know, in my mind, one of the strategic effects here is that framework claims for this position should make sure that those link arguments stick to the AF in the instance of the affirmative going for a permutation strategy. I think a very common set of debates will be, the kind of people will read a link argument in the 1NC about criminal justice reform, or just reformist efforts are easily co-opted. And I don't want to suggest that that's not an important argument. I'll get into that in a second here, but that might be as far as some of these negative link arguments get. And if that's the case, defeating an affirmative permutation that is either a recharacterization of the AF as not purely reformist, one that incorporates ostensibly some of the larger abolitionist principles or activities, that permutation might, for some judges, be fairly difficult to defeat if you're explaining abolitionism simply as an argument about the scope of the action of the plan, rather than the value choices or systems logics that underlie a number of the affirmative advantages. So, from the perspective of many abolitionists, the economy advantage is as much about hierarchy and oppression as some of the, kind of links about small scale reform. Because for one, abolitionists might see a number of those systems as interlinked together. That is, that our political economy, is itself bound up in carcerality, kind of the term that I was defining earlier. And those framework arguments then are going to have to include some, like even that kind of little quote from, I'm just trying to deal with somebody already mentioned how difficult it can be to follow some of this. That's why I'm trying to stick with a smaller set of cards. Even that card that I was quoting from earlier, right? That notion that there's a kind of narrative process that is important for thinking about the way in which logics of carcerality appear in our society, that a number of these different narratives or, kind of socio-political values, the kind of mainstream impacts that we read, those presume by and large that our society as a whole is organized correctly, even if our criminal justice system is not, right? That our criminal justice system doesn't align with the goals that we have as a society, but that those goals are by and large, that we don't need to change those a great deal. And from an abolitionist perspective, the goals and the means that we choose are strongly connected, and we should see a number of those goals as themselves influencing why our society is invested in these techniques or technologies of captivity. Okay. And I do think, so I've stressed the kind of link arguments that are about things other than the plan. One of the other strategic implications, and I do want to talk through some of the criticisms of reformism that are very commonly found in this. This set of cards will not be difficult to find. The way to think about this strategically, I think, is to think a little bit about how much the plans on this topic and the kind of 1ACs that you're working on in lab in some ways are informed by the need to answer other major negative strategies, right? So like states being one of the primary ones. There's a reason that I think that a lot of affirmatives read on this topic will oddly, kind of skirt some of the issues that we find in terms of large scale imprisonment, mass incarceration. I suggested earlier that some of that terminology might not be used by abolitionists anyway, but that affirmative plans are crafted based on some of the other strategic kind of limitations or categories that affirmatives need to think about. And, that's one of the ways to start, crafting your choice about whether or not to read a link argument to the plan, is to start thinking about how and why some of those plans are designed as they are, around some of these other constraints that are accepted by most affirmatives, and that those might give you some ground on the negative as well. So one example here, right, there are, I think, going to be a number of court actor affirmatives, right, in which the federal courts issue a ruling with regard to a particular practice in criminal justice. And part of the reason for that is, the crafting of precedent-based advantages that are designed to get into other areas that are beyond criminal justice, or as a way to help deal with some of the issues related to state practices, right? So that it's like you can both expand the scope of the effects of the AF by making it a ruling, by the federal judiciary, by the Supreme Court, in all likelihood, though probably not in the plan text. And that if you think about for a moment just all of those advantages are crafted in some way, shape, or form around the idea and effectiveness of legal precedent, as the law operates in such a way that precedent is applied largely neutrally, that is, without regards to ideology, that the kind of precedential effects or spillover of the affirmative ruling, just reflects the way that courts operate by, we kind of, in debate, there's a strategic incentive to treat the way that courts operate as kind of rigidly in lockstep with, a number of these court rulings are going to be fairly left-wing perspectives on how to interpret the U.S. Constitution. And, we don't have a left-wing court. And so there are a variety of ways in which this criticism might speak to the kind of faith in the courts to operate as though they are ideologically aligned with some of the goals of the affirmative, when in fact the rule of law or the concept of neutrality itself reflects some of the historical baggage of a system designed around white supremacy. So that, kind of in thinking more broadly about what are the features of some of these plans that might be available for negative link arguments, I think thinking a great deal about the role of courts, precedent, and arguments about the rule of law, that'll be pretty important. The kind of other section that I wanted to mention here is the notion of reform versus revolution versus non-reformist reform. Okay, so many of the link arguments found in the kind of abolitionist writings on criminal justice reform, they use the word reform as the touchstone for that's where this abolitionist perspective it takes the discourse of reform, or the speech about reform, as a starting point for understanding the inadequacies of most of these responses. And the reason that it does that is that, reform, kind of in the way that I was talking about above, right, can easily be system conserving. That is, to reform something is to reform it. It needs to take a different form, but kind of the overall design doesn't need to change all that much. And if you think about impacts as value statements, right, like an impact is something that we think ought to be weighed when a judge is deciding a debate. An impact is a value statement, and most of these reformist options will be organized around value statements that are not abolitionist in nature. And so that's another way to think about a little bit more broadly the way that the language of reform isn't just about the plan text. On the other hand, I would caution against the negative being too invested in only reading link arguments about reform, that simply because something is under the resolution of criminal justice reform, that means that automatically, we're talking about something that is likely to be co-opted or is small in scope. So, just for example, this is where you might find some affirmative evidence centered on the notion of non-reformist reform. That is, that there are some changes that are made to elements of the criminal justice system that are designed not to be system conserving, but instead system altering. That is, if this is a change that's made, it operates as kind of a wedge or a lever for a larger set of changes, a larger set of schemes. Like on both sides of kind of a debate about qualified immunity, for example, for police officers, right? One of the things that Miles mentioned in his topic lecture, there's one way that you could look at that as potentially a non-reformist reform, because, many elements of political and economic power that are built around policing institutions are, centered on the exceptional way in which we treat the legal obligations and kind of legal harms that can be perpetrated by police officers. On the other hand, some might characterize that reform as potentially system conserving, because ending legal immunity just means that then, you have the ability to bring a set of suits in U.S. courts against police officers. The prospects for winning a suit, kind of achieving the legal ends that you're supposed to, that depends on access to resources, on kind of the credibility of different types of testimony, right? The kind of the operations, if the operation of the legal system itself is not changed, then, ending qualified immunity might mean that there are actors then who are seeking justice in a system that isn't really designed to provide it to people who are people of color or who are poor. So, you might think of that as an example of just like, there are going to be a lot of debates about how to characterize the way in which we understand affirmative plan texts, and really getting into some of the specifics of the outcomes that, are they system conserving or are they system altering? I think that might be a way to think about, designing both affirmative permutation strategy and then also negative alternative strategy. Like, the same reason that many people kind of think that a permutation might be a really, really difficult strategy to beat for this position, can also be an argument that that's how you design your alternative. So like some of these cards that people might read as permutation cards from Angela Davis about, kind of specific examples of plans, I think that those might also be potentially fruitful alternative cards that make the barrier for explaining the alternative a little bit lower, because then what you're really getting at is, does the 1AC really position itself as a non-reformist reform? Are there other elements of the narrative structure of the 1AC, its discursive choices or its value statements that, mean that it's actually designed to be system conserving? So you might think of that as like, that's not just a debate about a permutation strategy, that's also a debate about alternative strategy. The negative might be able to craft some alternative arguments that, kind of preempt or attempt to kind of co-opt some of that style of permutation strategy on the part of the affirmative. And then one of the last things that I'd mention here about the kind of some of the alternative explanations, since it fits in this category, there are a large number of abolitionists who are pretty strongly anti-statist. And in particular, given that they tend to view the legal system or the concept of law and order, legal neutrality, legal process itself as, tied in with carcerality, that leads to some, fairly strong anti-statist rhetoric and position taking on the part of many abolitionists. And I put that out there as an example of, one, that may be a set of turns that affirmatives could think about. When I get into the second position that I'm going to talk about here, there are some other interpretations about criminal justice that might stress the ways in which anti-statism could be damaging. I think that that's also, the way that if it plays out how we are accustomed to seeing debate strategy play out, that may mean that that's kind of the broadest link category that the negative chooses, because it'll be available a lot. The word of caution that I have here for some negatives is, when you choose to read that set of link arguments and that set of alternative evidence, you're talking about something that's like, it's much more difficult to permute. It may also be more difficult to win some of the arguments about, kind of the effectiveness of your alternative. I think that there are a number of cards that address that kind of question of anti-statism more generally that, the affirmative might be able to read, that aren't necessarily focused even on abolitionism, but just the possibility of success for movements against the state. I'm going to pause here for another section of questions. Someone asked, could you make an argument that trusting the Supreme Court will always make left-wing decisions as a form of harmful productive power? It places faith in a system that is unreliable or not invested in the interests of marginalized people. Broadly, yes. I mean, I think that that's part of what I was trying to explain there with this notion of part of what's being produced there, or a productive element of power, is a certain vision of law and order. So if I went back to, a phrase from that Rodriguez evidence, right? Incarceration is a technology of social order and a cohering of peace, lawfulness, and security through war, violence, and punishment. So, even not even from an abolitionist perspective, there's a famous law review by a law professor, Robert Cover, where he refers to the law taking place on a field of pain and death. Okay. And, this is, Robert Cover is not an abolitionist. In many ways, it's like that article is a fairly mainstream legal article that's cited in a number of different contexts, largely because Cover wrote it as a way to emphasize that the legal system is a way of organizing punishment and violence rather than a way of avoiding it. So, in the narrative of law and order, it's often treated as law is the alternative to violence, right? That law is a civilized way of dealing with the imposition of violent ends and punishment. And it's civilized, and I'm using that word intentionally here, because it is regular, it follows certain logical procedures, it is imbued with reason, capital R. And so the criticisms of reason, capital R, as grounded in a particular Western tradition that comes out of and is grounded in colonialism, that's another place where some of these examples of productive power, what it means to be reasonable, what it means to be trusted, what it means to be regular, right? That those are things that, they don't just come out of nowhere, and they require their polar opposite for definition. Like in order to have reason, you must have the irrational or the unreasonable. So yes, I think that question is an interesting way to approach some of this. Examples of alternative arguments. Well, the kind of concept of abolitionist practice, I would say, is the broadest kind of overarching label for the way that abolitionists think of their alternative. If you read some of these pieces of evidence, there will be different social movements that are cited, different campaigns. So like, Rodriguez cites We Charge Genocide as a way of kind of an example of a movement-oriented activity that is designed to interrogate or challenge the logic of carcerality rather than the instance of, quote, police brutality, right? That We Charge Genocide is an argument that kind of places the activities of policing in a larger frame that says genocide is a foundational aspect of the building of the United States as a country. And, so I think that, when you're explaining some of these alternative arguments, it's likely that you'd be in good shape turning to some of the historical examples that are cited by a number of these authors. Rather than kind of list them out here, I would just say that that's an issue for research and familiarity. Answering cross-ex questions persuasively is going to involve knowing some more details about that set of material. I think also Sean's history lecture is going to cover some of the movement-oriented activity. There are also, it might be interesting that you could watch, I think streaming on Netflix right now, if I remember correctly, is the Black Power mixtape, just a set of documentary footage that covers a lot of Angela Davis's activities during the Black Panther Party era and from other Black radicals. It might give you a sense of what kind of some of the language and frame used by that set of activists really entails. That it's one that's heavily rooted in decolonization or anti-colonialism. It's also a broadly important international movement and international phenomenon in the 60s and in particular. And, so some of the language that these alternative arguments use are informed by this notion that the US criminal justice system really needs to be placed in a much larger context, and movements against or opposing the logics found in those systems then have a much broader set of targets as well. I hope that helps. Explaining the AF as a non-reformist reform, that's going to have to be grounded in evidence. That there are, I've tried to phrase this as generally system preserving or system conserving versus system altering. So you would really need to be thinking through ways in which plans might be system altering. For some cases, that's going to be a little bit difficult. There may be built in here as well as I generally see people explain permutation arguments right now very thinly. They generally do not explain portions of an alternative argument that is being permuted. That's a place here where kind of getting into the negative alternative evidence a little bit and unpacking it in connection to the affirmative plan may be important. One other thing that I should mention here is, since I've tried to kind of caution people against too much plan focus in debating this set of arguments, is, the affirmative advantage choice and critical affirmatives could easily go the other direction of explicitly setting up the concept of, there's an article on abolitionist constitutionalism that's like 100 plus page Harvard Law Review article from last year that really gets into some ways of thinking about abolitionist practice in connection with the interpretation of the US Constitution. I think that there are a number of ways in which couching the language of the 1AC, it is true that for some of these plan texts, you would sort of be having to win a combination of the plan as a non-reformist reform, but part of that is also because it's contextualized by a narrative or a larger interpretation that says the plan is a part of our political program, but not the entirety of it. Here are the other ways in which parts of the 1AC that we chose to, kind of explicitly put in connection with that, contextualize how you should understand the plan. That argument can work both ways. I rarely see affirmatives do a lot of that. It's just kind of like thinking about crafting like part of answering the abolitionism K is thinking about crafting a 1AC, not about crafting just a plan. So that might be worth thinking about. What is the relationship between abolition and the Westphalian notion of sovereignty? There is I think, a pretty strong criticism of sovereignty here insofar as there is a criticism of liberalism and the discourse of liberal rights. Liberalism is grounded in the notion of a sovereign subject, that is, a subject that owns itself, that is proper to itself. And it tends towards an individualist philosophy. And so as an example, some of the precedents that are likely to be applied here that are grounded in liberal notions of protection from search and seizure, right? There's large debates about the Eighth Amendment and cruel and unusual punishment in a similar vein. That plenty of those criticisms then are also either implicitly or explicitly criticisms of a system of sovereignty and an organization of nation states as systems of legal order. That's part of the reason why I think explaining some of these alternative arguments could be a little bit difficult, because then you're setting the bar pretty high for what an alternative needs to achieve. Key framework arguments to read on the AF. Well, I guess what I was suggesting there is that part of the reason that you want to be thinking about 1AC strategy is that then you're thinking about defense. Like, I rarely see affirmative teams take advantage of something that I think is pretty important here, which is that, one, you don't think about the 1AC through the lens of no link. You think about it from the perspective of which set of link arguments you want to defend against. So in reading a court's advantage or a rights-based advantage, you would need defenses of those kind of conceptualizations of rights, the application of a legal frame of precedent. There are very strong defenses of those perspectives as well. Like there are a large number of legal scholars who are writing kind of in that vein. And, so some of those key arguments are to think about what happens. To me, there's the theory argument about plan focus, like the judge should make the decision according to whether or not the plan is superior to the status quo or a counterplan. And most people make their framework arguments and then make their permutation arguments in ways that depend on winning the plan focus argument. So as though all you were permuting, like this is the debate over, is the AF severing out of portions of the 1AC basically by trying to defend just the plan in combination with the alternative. And so my major suggestion here is to think about what set of permutation arguments or defenses of the affirmative frame you might make that would help you win, even if you lose that the plan is the sole focus of the debate. So like, our use of the, this set of frames grounded in rights, for example, has these productive features. Like, this is why we ought to do this. And, an example, just looking at that abolitionist constitutionalism article would be an example of kind of a place to start there. Just like, that's making a positive case for phrasing abolitionist goals and programs in terms that are connected to the Constitution, rather than kind of rejecting it as a pact with slaveholders. To echo some of the things that I think are in Shree's discussion about pessimism, there might be some overlap there. Transformative or restorative justice. I said I would mention this and then didn't. I think that this is an interesting angle for explaining some of the abolitionist perspectives. I think that you're going to find that there's a pretty complicated relationship to between some restorative justice scholars and some abolitionists. But this notion of designing, non-punitive systems, restorative justice has some thoughts about that too. So, restorative justice tends to be grounded in the notion of nonviolence. not exclusively, but many of the advocates of restorative justice are interested in nonviolence. And, you know, as Miles mentioned, kind of it's an entirely different way of thinking about crime. That crime isn't really about an individual offender. Crime is about a set of community and social conditions. And so the obligation to deal with crime is an obligation that is incumbent upon the community rather than upon an individual. Like, you don't rehabilitate an individual, you restore the community in the face of harm. And you know that process is intended to be nonviolent and informed by democratic norms and values. Some of the deeper criticisms of some elements of democracy, that is, or representative democracy, you know, that's where you could get into some tension between these two positions, or some possibilities that they might synergize. I'm going to save a couple of these questions for kind of the end section, because I do want to get to a little bit of right on crime stuff before we need to take a break. The right on crime, kind of critique of right on crime, is what a few of the staff members have been thinking about. Is, you know, there's a specific conservative organization with a number of prominent kind of Republican political figures who have coalesced around this concept of right on crime. And it's a set of, you know, conservative critics of mass incarceration. And, you know, the critics of right on crime are generally critical of the rationale and the kind of value scheme that is proposed by a number of the right on crime advocates. So you might think of this as a critique that's a specific twist on criticisms of neoliberalism. To discuss that notion of problem definition that I mentioned earlier in the discussion of abolitionism, the problem definition that the kind of critics of right on crime have is that the rise of mass incarceration coincides with the hollowing out of the institutions that are designed to provide social provision or collective organization. So schools, healthcare, unions, you know, and also with the deindustrialization of the American economy. So that, you know, the movement away from an industrial American economy, you know, kind of union jobs in manufacturing, and communities organized around stable employment, and deindustrialization kind of starts in the 70s in the United States, and proceeds through the 80s and 90s. That those two elements have produced an environment in which criminal institutions are increasingly taking the place of alternative forms of social provision. So that, you know, a number of the kind of get tough on crime, retributive components of right-wing discourse on criminal control found in the 80s and 90s, that the fact that now you have right-wing conservatives willing to say that mass incarceration is bad doesn't mean that they're really going to do so in a way that will produce an end to a number of the negative features that we associate with mass incarceration. So, for example, this is a set of critics who really think that there is a deep connection between the right on crime focus on efficiency, evidence-based forms of criminal justice reform, right? This notion that essentially it's a technical problem to be resolved by social science. We'll do a series of investigations about what does and doesn't work, and then we'll implement that set of reforms in kind of the most politically neutral way possible. And the criticism that this set of people has against the right on crime people is that instead we need a kind of value-informed vision that takes into account and provides a counter narrative to this kind of right on crime focus on efficiency, managing resources in state budgets effectively, as a way to provide an alternative set of institutional designs. So just to read, like, one of the kind of prominent places, prominent people for organizing this sort of right on crime I'd recommend reading Marie Gottschalk. I'll go ahead and post in the chat here the spelling of that name because it's unusual. And she's got a recent book called Caught: The Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics that I think would be interesting to read if this is a kind of section that you're interested in. One of the major things to note is that this position is not anti-statist, right? And could be like abolitionism and the right on crime people have some interesting, like there's some overlap, but there's also some periods, some places of really significant disagreement. So if part of the interpretation here is that, it's kind of a hollowing out of a number of these forms of state social provision that is in part responsible for mass incarceration. And this is a set of people who are much more likely to use the language of mass incarceration in defining this problem. That is, they tend to think that this is an exceptional situation that's produced by a conjunction of a number of different factors instead of something that we should view only as continuous with other elements of US history. To give you a sense, I'll read a card from Gottschalk to give you a sense about kind of what some of these positions might say. So, recasting the problem of mass incarceration in econometric or cost-benefit language is problematic in many ways. It does little to challenge the excessively punitive rhetoric that has left such a pernicious mark on penal policy over the last half century. It is also no match for the considerable economic interests that are now deeply invested in the perpetuation of the carceral state. Furthermore, it constricts the political space to challenge penal policies and practices on social justice or human rights grounds. Among the elite policymakers and wider public, creating a safe, healthy, and humane penal system is generally not considered a credible and desirable public policy goal on its own. This goal has to be linked somehow to enhancing public safety and saving public money. Encased in a shell of evidence-based research, the 3R approach is broadly seen as a way of writing the politics out of penal reform. This goal comes at a high cost. It leaves largely unchallenged and unquestioned the political calculations and interests that built the carceral state in the first place. The narrow emphasis on evidence-based research related to recidivism fosters the impression that the birth of the carceral state was a result of bad or non-existent research rather than bad politics or bad policy. And I think that you'll find in this area, you might even notice there how much that language contrasts with some aspects of abolitionism, right? That implicitly, this is endorsing the notion that there should be a paradigm for criminal justice, that it does not reject the idea of criminality as a whole, nor the notion of human or civil rights-based advocacy, but instead says essentially that those are alternative frames that could be offered for broad-scale changes to the criminal justice system. So you might see these as positions that one might be the neg to the other, teams that are trying to characterize their politics as abolitionists, or teams that are trying to characterize their politics as more sweeping as a non-reformist reform because they take on this kind of right on crime rhetoric and approach. I think that those provide some interesting strategic interactions. But it also makes, like, one of the things that I would say is that depending on the theoretical orientation of your judge, this style of position leaves you open to explaining some plan inclusive alternatives that say basically, depends on the plan. Like, not all of the, you could read link arguments to some of these plans from this perspective. And so I don't want to suggest that all explanations of this alternative would be plan inclusive, but given the cards that this set of people writes about the importance of the frame for criminal justice advocacy and whether or not that frame is one that challenges this kind of hollowing out of social provision, and it calls for an explicitly justice-based or rights-based advocacy, there are a variety of strategic reasons in debates that people tend to be reluctant to write affirmatives that are primarily oriented around this notion of rights or justice. Some of the strategic considerations that we talked about earlier in terms of state's counterplan, executive clemency, et cetera. There's a reason that some of these affirmatives, are not going to take head on some of the debates about what justice means, what justice would mean as an end to mass incarceration. And I think that this set of positions could be designed to take advantage of that affirmative reluctance and to say, essentially, that is a language that we need to develop. That is a language that we need to use. We ought to be thinking a lot about civil and human rights-based advocacy in response to some of these problems. That gets into that notion of problem definition. That is, we need the proper definition of problem in order for the solution to play out well. One last thing that I would mention about this set of authors, and if you read Cott in particular, there are many, many examples here of kind of the ways in which reformist impulses can easily be co-opted. So, for example, mandatory minimums, which are now the subject of a lot of debate, and you'll probably debate some mandatory minimums affirmatives this year. Mandatory minimums came out of a reformist effort to deal with racial disparities in sentencing. Okay, that essentially it's like that a group of people in the 80s read racial disparities in sentencing as a product of prosecutorial and judicial discretion, that it basically, biases found among prosecutors and judges, if the U.S. limited the ability of those biases to influence sentencing, that then we would end up with a much more fair, that is, not racially disparate set of sentences. Well, for one, this ended up, in terms of the politics of the 80s and 90s, supporting, a number of, like, it was easily incorporated into this notion of, well, as long as these sentences are, not racially disparate, they should and can be much more punitive. It's like it fit with a kind of move towards a retributive model of criminal justice rather than a rehabilitative one. And that, those mandatory minimums and kind of 3 strikes you're out laws are another example of this. There are a variety of ways in which some, reformist efforts, and all of these people also stressed that the invention of the penitentiary, the prison, was itself originally considered a reformist element. That is, you moved away from kind of like public spectacle style criminal punishments or religiously oriented criminal punishment. The penitentiary has some religious influence as well, but just like you wouldn't put people in the stocks in the square and, shout at them and throw food at them, that they were going to be in prison to reflect on the immoral nature of their crimes. So, I think getting into some of that history of the way in which different elements of reform have helped produce some system conserving aspects of criminal justice, that's a fruitful area in this position as well. Like I said, that's a little bit faster than I wanted to spend on this position. That's only about like 10 or 15 minutes, but I do want to leave some period here for Q&A before and a break before lab. So if people have questions about that area, if they want me to return to some of the questions that they might have had about earlier portions of this, I'm happy to address those as well. Or also, for those of you who watched the kind of fundamentals of critique debating intro and had questions about how I explain that, because I tend to, I think a lot of people explain critiques as, it's like a counterplan and a disad. The alternative is like a counterplan. I tend to think that actually alternatives and counterplans are pretty different. That's part of the reason that I also talked about the ways in which, we use the word link for both disadvantages and critiques, but we mean really different things when we use that word in those 2 contexts. So good time for Q&A. Okay. Define the right on crime. That's a specific organization. It's like a political organization for conservatives who are proposing a set of criminal justice reforms, like end of mandatory minimums, or changes to mandatory minimums falls strongly in that category. In large part, this is an organization that says these policies fail on their own terms. That is, they are too expensive, they are inefficient, they don't actually reduce crime. And so when I've been talking about kind of system conserving ways of thinking about criminal justice, this is a system conserving way of thinking about criminal justice. It's like our society would be, it's conservative. It tries to conserve those other elements of our social system while saying these are exceptions or kind of, things that are going wrong because they don't serve the ends that we've actually designed them for. So I go ahead and post again if that didn't give you enough of a definition, but that's what I mean by referring to right on crime. And it's a pun. It's like right on crime, as in it's both correct and it's right wing. So it's conservative. Someone asked if a restorative justice system might not be compatible with abolitionism. Yes, I mean, I think that you will find that there are people on both sides of that combination trying to either say that they are compatible or that they aren't, because, even restorative justice, they tend to use the language of harm more than crime, but it's not as though restorative justice is a paradigm that's totally different from this notion of criminal justice. And so I think that is a place where you'd see some people who are, more or less comfortable with that combination. I mean, just using that example that I've referenced about that kind of abolitionist constitutionalism law review, like that's an example of somebody who is, kind of arguing with what otherwise might be some pretty deeply held positions by many abolitionists, that it's just like constitutional legal argument is not the place to go for abolitionist advocacy. But, there are always people trying to kind of craft these different combinations. And so one of the ways to research an area like this is to be familiar with some of the different people who try and fit these pieces together differently. Like there's no one, like this is abolitionism, this is the whole thing. There are a variety of people writing in that area who are going to say some different things about these combinations. And, you know, part of your job as a researcher is to try and craft positions that kind of coherently fit those pieces of evidence together so that you're not just kind of picking and choosing in ways where, you know, one link argument is totally contradictory with the way you're trying to explain the alternative, or, you know, the kind of impact argument that you've chosen uses language that your link arguments aren't, you know, wouldn't say is consistent. Like all of those things are important to keep track of. Somebody asked a question about kind of in arguments about precedent, what are the ways in which you could defend changing the relationship to the legal system within constitutional frameworks as opposed to breaking it down? That's like, that's kind of where I've been mentioning that abolitionist constitutionalism article. Honestly, like, you know, I can't summarize the 100+ pages of it. I think it would be good to go into something like that in detail and just sort of, you know, try and cut that set of cards to really understand some of the case that's being made there. I think that's going to serve you well rather than try and have me summarize it right here. Best general authors to read. I mean, I would take a look at some of Angela Davis's early work. I think Dylan Rodriguez is going to be a very prominent author on this set of stuff. I would also I'd recommend looking at some books or presentations by Robin Kelly. He's doesn't write as much about criminal justice specifically, but if you're kind of interested in takes on the Black radical tradition and then building out that kind of network of citation, I think he'd be a good person to start with because he's a pretty prominent historian of that tradition. Those are some of the places that I'd start, and then just build out your network of citations. Is it problematic to read a position that's focused on rhetoric and justification while also reading a set of positions that contradict that rhetoric and justifications conditionally? You know, this is an area of debate theory where I think that there is not a great deal of agreement. You will get a number of strong opinions and reactions to this based on, you know, how different judges feel about this. This is an example of a place where I would be reading judge philosophies closely and developing some experience with the judge pool in the set of tournaments that you're attending. Is just, yeah, there's no one answer to that. I tend to fall, I think, a little bit more on the neg conditionality side there than not, but, you know, it's a very neg friendly interpretation. And also, you know, like part of the reason that I would say that's the case is, you know, just from a tactical perspective, many affirmatives have a difficult time articulating which portions of which critique that you've read really get at why the theory of conditionality itself is wrong or unjustified or indicative of some of the values that you've indicted. An affirmative team that could do that might be in a good position to deal with this kind of I think there are a lot of 1 and C's that are going to have the abolition K, the state's counterplay on the net benefit to states, you know, something like that, whatever, federalism, some other disadvantage that, yeah, is not compatible with abolitionism. And a good thing to practice as an affirmative team might be trying to exploit some of that in terms of the set of cards that the negative reads for their framework arguments as a way to boost your argument about conditionality or the kind of importance of performative contradiction. If we want to use a different concept for talking about that relationship. But yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. It's not one that I can resolve for you because a lot of different judges treat that set of arguments pretty differently. Thank you all. Really appreciated a lot of good questions, a lot of interesting feedback, and hope this helps generate a set of discussions in lab as well. Good luck, and be on the lookout for those other resources that I mentioned that we're going to be providing via asynchronous videos for other critical topics.